Good morning. Today's hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China on growing constraints on language and ethnic identity in today's China will come to order. Before we turn to the subject of this hearing, I want to acknowledge that this is our first hearing since the publication of the Commission's annual report on human rights conditions and rule of law developments in China. Every year, the rigorously researched and sourced work of the Commission's nonpartisan research staff makes a profound contribution to the understanding of these issues in Congress, the executive branch, the academic and advocacy communities, and elsewhere. And that is certainly true again this year. When the Chinese government seeks to mislead the world about the treatment of Chinese citizens and the government's critics, the fact-based reporting of the CECC annual report shines a light and helps document the truth. Increasingly, this work informs and catalyzes meaningful action. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is the latest example in a string of significant laws that grew out of the CECC's reporting. As Congress now works to advance China-focused legislation, it's crucial that it include tangible steps advocated by this commission on a bipartisan and bicameral basis, such as expanded humanitarian pathways for Hong Kong residents and Uyghurs fleeing Chinese government persecution, as well as the creation of a China censorship monitor and action group to protect U.S. businesses and individuals from censorship and intimidation. I'd like to thank the commission's staff, incredible team, for its tireless, professional, and expert work preparing such a high-quality report. While it's truly a team effort with significant contributions from everyone on the team, I'd like to especially recognize Megan Fluker, who played an integral role in 8 of these annual reports and managed production of the last several before leaving the commission last fall. So, Megan, I know you're on your next chapter, but we really appreciate your many years of dedicated effort. Some of the most heartbreaking reporting details: the genocide being perpetuated against Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, as well as elements of eugenics and population control policies directed at ethnic minorities. These are not the only ways in which the Chinese Communist Party seeks to destroy religious and ethnic minorities. Chinese authorities have engaged in a years-long campaign of sinicization, requiring greater conformity with officially sanctioned interpretations of Chinese culture. One of the most pernicious aspects of this campaign targets ethnic minorities' language and identity. Under a policy that promises bilingual education, authorities, in fact, largely replace instruction in ethnic minority languages with instruction in Mandarin Chinese. Meanwhile, only a fraction of the language spoken or signed in China today receive official recognition and support, threatening the ability and rights of unrecognized language communities to use and develop their languages. These policies break promises made to ethnic minorities under China's constitution, under the regional ethnic autonomy law, and under international standards such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In this hearing, we will hear from expert witnesses about the sinicization campaign that runs afoul of these standards for protecting linguistic rights. We'll hear about recent substantial reductions in the use of Mongolian language instruction and the harsh crackdown on Mongolian culture that followed protests over these policies. We'll hear about insidious and widespread efforts to separate Tibetan children from their parents, placing them in boarding schools to disrupt the intergenerational transmission of mother languages. And we'll hear about the detention and imprisonment that often befalls those who stand up for language, who stand up for cultural rights, including the personal experience of one of our witnesses after he opened a Uyghur language kindergarten. This coercive assimilation erodes language, culture, and identity for ethnic minorities in China. I look forward to today's witnesses helping the Commission better understand the costs to communities of these policies as we work with Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongolians, and others to protect their cultures from destruction. I'd now like to recognize Congressman McGovern for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing on language and identity in the People's Republic of China. First, I want to join you in welcoming the release of the Commission's annual report for 2021 last week. It comprehensively documents the Chinese government's appalling human rights record, and the report takes countless hours to research, write, fact-check, and publish. I particularly want to praise the Commission's professional staff of researchers for their expertise and skill in producing each annual report. They do amazing work and are a valued resource for this Commission and the entire Congress. Again, these researchers do their work objectively. They check out every single fact. The reporting is impeccably accurate, which makes this report especially powerful. And again, I can't thank them enough, but those of both parties who care about human rights ought to recognize their incredible work. Let me quote from author James Baldwin in a 1979 essay. He writes, "Language is a political instrument, means, and proof of power. People evolve a language in order to describe and thus control their circumstances, or in order not to be submerged by a reality that they cannot articulate. And if they cannot articulate it, they are submerged." End quote. Baldwin was writing in a different context, but his message is one that anthropologists and political scientists confirm, that language is the core of a people's identity. The People's Republic of China is a multilingual society. There are 56 official languages and hundreds more that are not formally recognized by the state. On paper, language is protected under Chinese law. The PRC Constitution gives ethnic minorities the freedom to use and develop their own spoken and written languages and to preserve or reform their own ways and customs. In practice, however, we are witnessing the exact opposite. Government policies appear to promote standard Mandarin at the expense of other languages. This is happening as the party under Xi Jinping imposes a coercive conformity across all facets of society. This trend provides the context and the central question for this hearing. Is the Chinese government and party deliberately eroding the language rights of the ethnic minorities in a quest for majoritarian political control? And in doing so, isn't the government violating rights guaranteed under the Chinese Constitution and law? This commission has documented protests by Tibetans, Mongolians, and others against restrictions on their own languages. These protests are often suppressed. People are jailed for simply asking that their guaranteed rights be respected. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the threats to the Mongolian, Tibetan, and Uyghur languages under PRC policies, and what this means for the concept of ethnic autonomy. I also look forward to hearing about the vulnerability of the hundreds of unofficial languages which also deserve protection and preservation. So again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing, and I will yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative McGovern. And I'd now like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Dr. Gerald Roche is an anthropologist who is currently a senior research fellow at La Trobe University, a La Trobe Asia fellow, and a co-chair of the Global Coalition for Language Rights. His work focuses on issues of power, the state, colonialism, and race in Asia. He has researched and written on issues of language oppression, racism, ethnicity, urbanization, popular music, and community ritual in the region. Mr. Ngubatu Togochug is the director of the Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center, a New York-based human rights organization he established in 2001, dedicated to protecting the rights of the Mongolian people in Inner Mongolia. He is the chief editor of Southern Mongolia Watch and has testified before the UN Human Rights Council, UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UN Forum on Minority Issues, UN Committee Against Torture, and the European Parliament. Ms. Ladun Taetong is the co-founder and director of the Tibet Action Institute. She served previously as executive director of Students for a Free Tibet and led the campaign to condemn China's rule of Tibet in the lead up to the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. Her real-time accounts of her travels through Beijing on her blog, one of the first in the Tibetan world, led to her detention and deportation from China. Mr. Abduweli Ayub is a linguist, poet, and former political prisoner, a proponent of linguistic rights and active promoter of Uyghur language education. He opened language schools and kindergartens in Xinjiang, for which he was subjected to repeated interrogations, harassment, and eventually a 15-month detention. After fleeing China with his family in 2015, he founded Uyghur Yelp to document the Uyghur plight and aid the Uyghur diaspora. We'll now turn to our witnesses for their testimony. 5 minutes each, if you can possibly do that, starting with Dr. Roche.
Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone, from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Thank you sincerely for this opportunity to testify today. I deeply appreciate the chance to share with you all some insights into the language rights situation for people in China, and I thank the Commission for bringing attention to this important topic. This topic is important because defending language rights ensures dignity, freedom, and equality for all people. And who amongst us would want to live without any of these? When people are denied language rights, it severs their connections to their family, community, and heritage. It excludes them from political participation. When people are denied language rights in vital services like healthcare, their lives are at risk. And when they are denied language rights in education, their futures are at risk. Millions of people in China today face these challenges due to the state's denial of language rights. This happens primarily in two ways: erasure and suppression. Erasure refers to the state's refusal to acknowledge the existence of most of China's languages by calling them dialects. To put this in perspective, imagine if German, English, and Norwegian were defined as dialects of a single language. Imagine if your government told you what language you speak. How would you feel? In China, erasure means that from the country's 300 or so languages, only about 56 are recognized as languages, one for each of the country's nationalities. Most people in China speak unrecognized languages, whether they belong to the Han majority or to a minority group. Most people in China are therefore completely denied their language rights. Our research demonstrates the catastrophic impact of this denial in Tibet. Tibetan people in China use about 30 unrecognized languages, not including Tibetan. People who use these unrecognized languages face linguistic barriers everywhere, in school, media, government, healthcare, the legal system, and so on. When the government refuses to remove these barriers, people are forced to adapt by changing their language to either Tibetan or Chinese. Meanwhile, recognized languages like Uyghur, Mongolian, and Tibetan are suppressed. Suppression happens through the gradual dilution of the Chinese constitution's language freedoms and the pervasive under-implementation of protections for minority languages. Suppression also takes place through the encroachment of the national language, Mandarin, into spaces for minority languages, part of a broader plan to universalize Mandarin amongst the entire population. The cumulative impact of erasure and suppression mean that at least half of China's languages are currently losing speakers or signers as they switch to dominant languages. In an open democratic society, people would be lobbying and protesting to change this unjust system. But in China, particularly under Xi Jinping, civil society has become increasingly repressed domestically and isolated internationally. China's citizens will therefore be denied an unprecedented historic opportunity to defend language rights, namely, the United Nations International Decade for Indigenous Languages, which starts this year. China will prevent its citizens from participating in this event because it denies that it has indigenous people and it denies its colonial history. The goal of this decade is leaving no one behind and no one outside. We have a responsibility to extend this inclusion to people in China to ensure that they are not left out or behind. So here are some suggestions of how we can do this. Number one, the US must pressure China to clarify whether its citizens are able to identify as indigenous and whether they can participate in the UN decade. An ideal time to do this is China's upcoming Universal Periodic Review in the UN Human Rights Council in November 2023. Secondly, China's efforts to isolate its citizens from international civil society need to be countered. We must raise awareness inside China of language rights and of activities taking place globally during the UN decade. Number three, with specific regard to Tibet, earmarking funding for Tibet's unrecognized languages will make a huge difference, and this can be done using funds allocated under the Tibet Policy Act. Number four, finally, the US needs to lead by example. The UN Declaration of the Rights for Indigenous People should be formally endorsed and its obligations respected. Failing to do so will enable China to defer attention from their language rights violations and onto America's. Thank you for listening, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And now we'll turn to Mr. Toguchuk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Co-Chair, and distinguished member of the Commission for holding this hearing. My name is Engbat Tochak. I'm a Mongolian from Southern Mongolia, also known as Inner Mongolia. What's happening in Southern Mongolia today is what the Mongolians regard as a wholesale cultural genocide aimed at the total eradication of Mongolian language, culture, and identity. In 2020, responding to China's new language policy, the Mongolians carried out a massive resistance movement. 300,000 Mongolian students went on a total school strike. The Chinese authorities responded with massive arrests. An estimated 8,000 to 10,000 protesters have been arrested, detained, imprisoned, and placed under house arrest. 11 lost their lives in defense of their rights to their mother tongue. What followed this heavy-handed crackdown was a full-scale cultural genocide campaign, the scope of which has extended far beyond the simple switch of language in schools. Learn Chinese and become a civilized person has been an official slogan publicly promoting Chinese supremacy. Mongolian language programs have been removed from radio, television, and newspapers or replaced with the Chinese ones. Students are subject to military-style training and must sing red songs to extol the greatness of China. Teachers are brought to the communist red base Yan'an to receive a patriotic education. To justify the campaign, the Chinese National Congress announced last year that the local laws on the right to education in minority languages are unconstitutional. Subjects on Mongolian culture and history have been removed from curriculums for emphasizing Mongolian ethnic identity. All extracurricular activities for learning Mongolian have been banned. Mongolian traditional arts and performance have been altered to adopt the Chinese style to reflect the superiority of Chinese culture. Mongolian sacred sites have been taken over by Chinese traditional art performers, and Mongolian customs and ritual ceremonies are scorned and mocked. Sculptures, monuments, and buildings with Mongolian characteristics have been taken down. Signs in Mongolian have been removed from schools, buildings, streets, and parks. Mongolian publications have been banned. Books have been removed from shelves. Printing and copy service have been ordered not to provide service for any materials written in Mongolian. Postal and courier service are instructed not to deliver any Mongolian books and publications. Starting December 2020, a region-wide training program called the Training for the Firm Inculcation of the Chinese Nationality Common Identity was launched. All Mongolian students, teachers, government employees, party members, and ordinary herders were targeted for the training. A 47-page pamphlet marked as an internal document was issued to detail the urgency and goal of the training and to compel Mongolians to fully accept the Chinese identity and Chinese culture. The document also warns Mongolians that the wrong path of narrow nationalism can lead to the return of national separatism. The trainees told us that During the training, they must denounce their narrow nationalism and nationalistic feeling. They must surrender all of their social contact and the details of their online activities to the authorities. They are forced to confess their supposed mistakes, including wearing Mongolian clothes and singing Mongolian songs. They had to answer multiple questionnaires designed to assess their ideological improvement. One of the questions a trainee said was, "How many Chinese friends do you have?" Those who answered none or few had to go through further training before they are allowed to graduate. Before their release, all trainees signed a paper promising that they would not engage in any activities highlighting Mongolian characteristics or expressing Mongolian nationalistic feeling. This is what's happening in Southern Mongolia today. Considering these deteriorating conditions, China's determination to erase the Mongolian language, culture, and identity, and the lack of support from the international community, I would like to make the following recommendations to the United States Congress. One, conduct further hearings and testimonies to investigate the serious human rights violations in Southern Mongolia, in particular, the ongoing cultural genocide. Two, establish the Mongolian language broadcast on Voice of America and/or Radio Free Asia to help Southern Mongolians have access to the free and democratic world. Three, introduce and pass legislation similar to the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act and Tibet Policy and Support Act to support the 6 million Southern Mongolians in their effort to defend their basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony about the many, many ways that Mongolian language and culture are being impacted. We're now turning to Ms. Tatom.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Merkley, members of the committee, and CECC staff for this opportunity. As a Tibetan who has been working on the Sino-Tibetan conflict for more than 2 decades, I can say safely it takes a lot to shock me. But last year, when my colleagues and I began research into reports that Tibetan children were being sent to state-run boarding schools at an alarmingly high rate, we were stunned by what we found. Under the cover of darkness of China's near total information blackout of Tibet, the Chinese authorities have been constructing a massive colonial boarding school system that threatens the future survival of the Tibetan people and nation. These residential boarding schools are the cornerstone of a broader effort to wipe out Tibetan resistance by eliminating the 3 pillars of Tibetan identity: language, religion, and way of life. The schools streamline and fast-track this by ripping Tibetan children from their roots, stealing the language from their tongues, and trying to replace their identity with Chinese identity. In our report, we find that at least 800,000 to 900,000 Tibetan children, representing nearly 80% of all Tibetan children ages 6 to 18, are now separated from their families and living in colonial boarding schools. And this number does not include 4- and 5-year-olds being made to live in boarding preschools. These children are forbidden from practicing Tibetan Buddhism, they're cut off from authentic Tibetan culture, and they're not allowed to study in their own language. Instead, they're forced to study in Chinese, under mostly Chinese teachers, from textbooks that represent China's history and culture, while completely denying Tibet's own rich and ancient history and culture. On top of this, they're subjected to intense political indoctrination. And most Tibetan parents have no choice but to send their children away to these schools because China's shut down all the village schools and nearly all the alternatives. Parents who try to resist or refuse are threatened, harassed, fined, and face other serious punishments. One person from Tibet described the anguish of these separations for young children. Quote, "I know of children aged 4 to 5 who don't want to be separated from their mothers. They are forced to go to boarding schools. In some cases, the children cry for days, sticking to their mother's laps, begging not to be sent away, and even refusing to go back." End quote. My 5-year-old son started kindergarten this year. To think of sending him away at this age. to live apart from me for the rest of his school-age life. To think I wouldn't be able to comfort him or protect him day to day is devastating. And to know China's doing this intentionally so that Tibetan children are isolated from the influence of their parents and families is enraging. In the US, Canada, and Australia, residential boarding schools for Native American, Indigenous, and Aboriginal children are finally recognized as horrific and shameful mistakes of the past. Now is seen as the time for inquiries, reparations, and apologies, not as a time when any government would be deliberately implementing this genocidal model and on such a massive scale. But this is exactly what Beijing is doing. China's colonial boarding schools, together with policies that severely restrict the use of Tibetan language, that seek to hollow out Tibetan Buddhism and end the nomadic way of life, threaten Tibetan existence in every space in Tibet. What's happening in front of our eyes is the annihilation of Tibet as a civilization, as an identity, as a culture. It is cultural genocide, and Tibetans everywhere know it. Just last month, 25-year-old Tsewan Norbu, a famous Tibetan pop star, self-immolated in front of the Potala Palace in Lhasa. He had every reason to live. He was young, successful, college-educated. He had a family and resources, and his whole life was ahead of him. But he gave it all up in the ultimate sacrifice at the most meaningful location and political moment for Tibetans, on the eve of the anniversary of the 1959 Tibetan National Uprising. His life and lyrics suggest he did this because he wanted to send a message that no matter what personal success we may achieve, what matters most is our roots, our homeland, our culture, and our freedom to live on our own land and be who we are. Tsewan Norbu's final act illuminates a simple truth that's held strong in Tibet for 70 years under Chinese occupation. That generation after generation of Tibetans have shown their love and allegiance is to Tibet, to the mountains, to the grasslands, to our mother tongue, our great sages, spiritual teachers, and leaders, most especially to His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, and not to China, because Tibetans are not Chinese. And though Tibetans in Tibet continue to battle courageously against China's onslaught, they can't do it alone. They need people and governments in the free world to step up. And there is so much more that can be done. I think global opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown us how much the international community can do. We need to use every tool available to fight these genocidal dictators. Because a state that so blatantly flouts international rules and norms, and indeed actively seeks to undermine them, threatens us all. And the fate of Tibetans and Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, Hong Kongers, and Taiwanese affects us all. I'll end my remarks here and save my specific recommendations for the Q&A, and I'd also like to submit our report on China's colonial boarding school system in Tibet for the record. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Without objection, it will be submitted for the record. And now we'll turn to Ms. Abdul-Weli.
Thank you all and giving me this opportunity.
Mr. Abdul-Weli, excuse me.
Yeah. Let me start with the historical narrative. Like Uyghur, after Chinese communist rule, Uyghur language faced difficulty first. The first, like Uyghur alphabet revised. It means that after 1949, like Uyghurs cannot read what they have, their ancestor had written. For example, that like I cannot read what my grandpa had written in Uyghur. And second, in 1956, Chinese government changed Uyghur alphabet to a Russian, like Cyrillic alphabet. And then we have another literacy, and people cannot read in 5 years after 1914. And like 1962, Uyghur alphabet changed third time, and it's a Chinese phonetic pinyin, like Latin alphabet, and it used until 1979, and then into 1982, it changed again. It means that after 1949, Uyghur experienced 4 times alphabet changing. It means that like we have like millions of people become illiteracy because of this alphabet changing. And in 1982, since 1982, our alphabet hasn't been changed, but our orthography, like spelling system, changed a lot, experienced 5 times. And it make people a lot of trouble and cannot like communicate with written language because of this. And like since 1997, Uyghur language started to restricted, and in 2002, Uyghur language removed from higher education, like from higher education, like university, community college, and a technology college. All higher education system Uyghur removed, replaced as Han Chinese in education system. And because of this, 2006, Uyghur intellectuals in Urumqi started the campaign to restore legal rights of Uyghur. But this peaceful campaign ended up with one Uyghur sentenced 12 years, Memtimin Elyar, and another more than 10 Uyghurs sentenced with different term. And in 2011, I started my mother language campaign, and I had my mother language kindergarten. And because of this, I was arrested in August 19, 2013, and I spent my 428 days in Chinese detention center. And I was questioned, interrogated more than 6 months. And just let me confess and just let me admit that I have done this mother language campaign to separate China and like build independent Uyghur country. And I sexually abused and tortured, and like I experienced 6 months in torture, and I spent 428 days without sunshine and without using appropriate toilet, and without any health care. And since 2017, Chinese policy against Uyghur totally worst, and then Uyghur totally banned from public life. And Uyghur textbooks collected and burned in front of the students, and the Uyghur textbook editors arrested. Depending on Uyghur Yelp documentation, about 400 Uyghur writers who participated editing this Uyghur textbook got arrested, and thousands of mother language teachers got arrested. Among them, there are my friends, Ahmed Chanjume, he sentenced 14 years. And there are 3 Uyghur intellectuals sentenced life imprisonment, and 1 sentenced to death. His name is Sattar Saud. And second, Han Chinese officials appointed every Uyghur family and force Uyghurs speak Chinese at home and monitor their cultural practice. And third, Uyghur kids replaced from their home, and they forced to study at the boarding school. And depending on the other incidents, there are more than 900,000 Uyghur kids are in boarding school right now. And those, we know that, as we know, more than now up to 3 million Uyghurs are concentration camp, and their kids are in special kids camp. I met 2 of them because of they are a Turkish citizen, and they saved by Turkish government. And I met them in Istanbul in 2011, December. And when I asked, and they forgot their language in 2 years. They arrested in 2017 March, and they released in 2019 December. During 2 years, they totally forgot their mother language. At the time when they got arrested, the younger one is 4 years old, the another one is 6 years old. In 2 years, they forgot their language 100%. And we can imagine that up to 3 million Uyghurs are in concentration camp, and their kids are in kids camp, so-called boarding school. And we can imagine what happened to those kids. And then Uyghur kids replaced from their homeland. For example, that my niece, Saida, he replaced from his home and from his homeland. Now he is studying in Chinese boarding school in Chinese majority city, not at home. And Uyghur kids forced to separate from their family, like they have to study in, like live in a boarding kindergarten. And depending on Adrian Zins, since 2017, like boarding kindergarten in Uyghur region increased more than 100 times. It's increasing very, very, very quickly. And fifth, and Uyghur kids sent to like kindergarten in inland China, not in Uyghur, East Turkestan. And it's really dangerous. And it means that those, we cannot find where they are at the end, because they will submerge in Chinese society. It's really dangerous, especially the kindergarten in Xi'an accepted Uyghur orphan kids. They call it orphan kids, but we don't know they are orphan or not, because of maybe their parents are in concentration camp. They sent to those in Chinese full yuan, it's orphanage, Chinese orphanage. And Uyghur kids in kindergarten, they were not allowed to speak Uyghur. And the social media video I received, and said that the teacher asked the kid's name, and the kid said, I'm not allowed to tell my name in Uyghur. I have to tell my name in Chinese. That those kids cannot even tell their name in Uyghur. Not they speak that language. They cannot even tell their name in their mother tongue because of afraid. And I think we need to take urgent action. And I waited for this testimony for more than 5 years. At the end, thank you everyone to give me this opportunity. And I think we need to take urgent action, especially for those innocent kids who separated from their family, who separated from their homeland, who separated from their culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your powerful testimony. The Senate is holding a vote on the required timeline, so I'm going to turn this over to Co-Chair Representative McGovern. I hope to be back, but it's a little uncertain. It may be back-to-back votes. But I just want to note especially the testimony about the combination of the assault on use of the language and ripping children out of their families' arms, to separate them, change the language, change the culture. It's an abomination. And you all have made that very clear today about the extensive use, both in the Uyghur communities and Mongolian communities and the Tibetan communities. Thank you. I hope to return, but if not, I turn this to Representative McGovern.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony. Let me begin with Mr. Togochog. In your testimony, you advocate for the creation of a Mongolian language service through the Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. And as I understand, Voice of America has currently or in the past broadcast in some 80 languages, but never Mongolian. Can you expand on what a Mongolian VOA service would mean for Southern Mongolians?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. So, Voice of America or Radio Free Asia, they do not have any Mongolian service at this moment. And I don't think in the past they had never had it either. So having a Mongolian service will be very helpful for the Southern Mongolians, because there is no the Mongolians do not have any channel or any way to communicate with the free and democratic world, and then their situation, their conditions are largely underreported, and so if we have such a broadcast service, that will help them to understand what's going on in the free and democratic world, and in the same time also it will allow them to have their voice heard to the international community and expose the human rights violations that are happening in Southern Mongolia, in particular the ongoing cultural genocide that is aiming at the complete erasure of Mongolian language, culture, and identity.
No, I appreciate that, and that's I think a helpful suggestion, and it's something we should explore in the upcoming appropriations process. Ms. Tetong, your testimony references the troubling experience in the United States, Canada, and Australia with residential boarding schools for Indigenous children. Can you speak to your perspective as a native of Canada on how the Canadian experience can help us view what you report about boarding schools in Tibet in terms of accountability, restitution, and social justice?
Thank you. I think it was one of the most disturbing parts of what we were doing when we were researching and writing this report, that a number of us on the team of Tibet Action were Canadian. And we were, the unmarked graves of First Nations children were being uncovered in Canada from the residential schools there as we were writing this report. And it was haunting for all of us. It also gave us a great sense of urgency to get this story out. Not that they're exactly the same situation, but that it's happening again in another place in a slightly different way, but the intent is the same. And I think for us, the key right now is that people don't know that this is happening, because the Chinese have so effectively blocked information from leaving Tibet. They've scared people from saying what's happening on the ground, and they are hiding what they're doing. But the Chinese government cares what the world thinks, and this is why they have all of these hidden policies in Tibet. It's so that they can avoid international scrutiny. They're hiding, the presence, the boarding preschools or kindergartens for 4 and 5-year-olds. They're actively hiding their existence. We know there are boarding schools for, there are preschools and kindergartens that are day schools, and we see those in Chinese state propaganda. But the actual boarding preschools, they're actively hiding. And so we know that the key right now is to expose and condemn directly and openly. We need the US government to do that. That is the beginning. That's where we start. We need the US government and to work with like-minded governments around the world to put a spotlight on this issue and to say it's unacceptable and that these schools need to be, children need to be returned to their parents, and they need to have access to high quality mother tongue education in their local areas, just like any of us, who grew up in free and open societies do, no matter how rural or whatever the challenges may be. I think it's important to note that in China itself, the rate of students even in rural areas the rate of boarding is drastically lower. So Tibetans are boarding at like 5 times the rate in the case of one primary school comparison that we did, primary age comparison, at 5 times the rate in just central Tibet, or what China calls the Tibetan Autonomous Region alone. I think the other thing that we need is to see, the world has collectively condemned residential school policy, the practice of separating children from their parents in order to influence, to change who they are, to erase their culture and identity. And we need to see that the UN speaks out on this, that Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, breaks her silence on Tibet. She hasn't even said Tibet since 2018 when she took up this mandate. So we need member states, we need the US government to push for accountability also at the UN.
Thank you. And I, as you were speaking, I was on a delegation with Speaker Pelosi. I think it was back in 2015 when they allowed us, the Chinese government actually allowed us to go into Lhasa and try to micromanage and control every single moment of that visit. But despite all of those efforts, we were amazed and quite frankly inspired by Tibetans who approached us to talk about, among other things, the importance of their language, the importance of their culture, the importance of giving their children a future in which the language and culture were a reality. This is their identity. This is who they are, and it was it was a trip that on one hand was depressing and shocking because of the Chinese government's repressive behavior, but on the other hand, inspiring, and motivating, because people at great risk found ways to communicate to us directly, and I will never ever forget it. But thank you for your response. Dr. Roche, many of us assume there is a single Tibetan language, but you testify to the diversity of languages spoken by Tibetans. And I appreciate the map that you provided us. Would a person from Lhasa be able to communicate with a person from the Dalai Lama's hometown of Amdo?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Just to very quickly answer that part, it depends on who those people were. There's great difference between the spoken languages between Lhasa and the far northern Amdo. And if two people met on the streets, chances are that they would not be able to communicate. But if they were educated in the common written language, if they had experience communicating with Tibetans from a wide variety of backgrounds, then they would probably be able to communicate. There's flexibility around that issue. But those are two examples of what linguists call Tibetic languages, which means that they are varieties of Tibetan. There are also about 250,000 Tibetans that use languages which are much more different than those group of Tibetic languages. They're vastly different from each other. And regardless of whether they were literate, regardless of how cosmopolitan they were, regardless of the amount of exposure, without concerted study, they would not be able to communicate with one another. So those languages, to give a an example that might help, it would be as different as Swedish and Italian, for example.
Showing these are all the color.
Most of the Tibetans who speak those languages, their communities are quite small, several thousand people amongst a broader population of over 6 million people. And given the situation that I've described, where the state completely denies language rights in any forum, in education, healthcare, media, governance, etc., those languages are facing a very serious predicament. And in terms of thinking through these issues that we're talking about today, about the impact of the denial of language rights, thinking about the state's goals in this, thinking about the program of sinicization and so on, we can think of these smaller languages spoken by Tibetans as the canary in the coal mine. They point the direction of where the actions of the state are going for other languages. And what we see across all of those languages is people are switching away from them. They're no longer transmitting those languages to their children. So in an expert survey that I did of linguists who work in this area, I asked their assessment of whether those languages would still be spoken in the future generations, and the answer was in almost every case that they would no longer be, that the children would be switching either to some form of Chinese or some form of Tibetan language.
Yeah, and I'm technologically challenged, but for those who are watching this, I mean, this is the map that you provided us, and all these different colors show the different distinct kind of Tibetan languages and dialects, which I think is fascinating, something that we don't always appreciate. I mean, when we're talking about protecting the language, how would an understanding of this linguistic diversity help the U.S. protect Tibetan language? And you made a recommendation earlier, but and maybe you could expand on it, how funding in the Tibetan Policy and Support Act could be used.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So these languages face a very intense predicament, and the speakers of these languages, also the people who sign them, because we should include Tibetan Sign Language here as well. These communities have no support from anywhere. They want to maintain these languages. They, in instances where they can, create projects to support these languages, educational initiatives, community chances to use the language, and so on. One of the most clear examples of the desire to use these languages was seen when the COVID pandemic broke in Tibet. And no public healthcare information was available to these communities in the languages that they understood best and which they trusted the most as well. And so that was creating great anxiety and putting those people at risk. So they initiated these community public health information translation projects on their own, without any funding, without any support, and so on. So the recommendation that I make, given the Tibet Policy Act in part focuses on the protection of Tibetan language and culture, is the idea that funds could be earmarked specifically for these languages. And that money could be used, for example, to transmit information to those communities about language rights, the fact that they have them, how those language rights are denied. If it was possible to get money to the communities on the ground to work with them, there's all sorts of projects that could be done to help those communities use their languages to develop them. For example, developing writing systems, recording the languages, helping develop vocabulary to use in new situations. And there are ample examples all around the world of different projects, different methods for helping to support a language that some of this funding could be used for, and that communities, Tibetan communities inside China, could learn from.
Well, thank you. And I know USAID has money for this, and I think maybe we need to work with USAID to find a grantee that could actually, actually do what you're talking about. I have other questions here, but I'm not sure if Congresswoman Steele is still on the line.
Yes.
Okay, why don't I yield to you for your questions, and I'll come back to me. All right.
Thank you, Co-Chair McGovern, and thank you very much, all the witnesses. It is alarming and disheartening that the CCP is working to restrict religious freedom and trying to eradicate entire cultures. The CCP is separating children from their parents, home, and communities that I can really think of. This is one more outrageous example of racism and troubling human rights violation at the hands of the CCP. Having said that, Ms. Ludden Teton, if I pronounce it wrong, I'm sorry, but you mentioned that private schools run by monasteries and Tibetan communities have been shut down by CCP. We already heard that Mr. Togochak for recommendations of what United States Congress has to do, but what can global leaders to do stop this violation? I try to let people, whole world know during the Olympic that what China has been doing, but I didn't get any responses from any corporate sponsors Olympic that they've been spending billions of dollars. So could you tell us that what global leaders has to do stop this violation?
Yeah, I think the key is, and we can see this happening more and more, but is for like-minded governments, global leaders to work together and to coordinate strategies and approaches in a way that really targets, like for example, in the case of sanctions, I think this whole area, unlike say targeting military or security people, officials, the area of education policy just seems it's such a different target. But there are Chinese academics and education policy experts who are working to, they're conceptualizing and they're operationalizing these programs that are separating, nearly 1 million Tibetan children from their parents, and that are essentially threatening that, an entire generation of Tibetans and those that come from now on will not speak Tibetan. So they're designing these genocidal policies and overseeing them, and they should be targeted, I think, for sanctions and other things. And governments can coordinate, I believe, to do that in a way that perhaps, the security officials and the top officials aren't so concerned about their international reputation or their travel or whatever, but academics do. I mean, that's, so much of what it's about is reputation and your international's credibility. And I think this group of people who are really playing key roles in all of this, the rollout and the separation of very young children from their families, they play a key role. And if we want to sort of change behavior and send a very clear message, I think they should absolutely be targeted with sanctions.
Very essential. Thank you very much. So parents, not the CCP, have the right to choose how their child will be educated. That's what we are practicing here. We try to. Why is the CCP so threatened by having a diverse community? Mr. Teton. Ms. Teton, sorry.
Because I think the key is difference, that because Tibetans are not Chinese, because Uyghurs are not Chinese, Southern Mongolians, we have our distinct histories, our distinct national histories. This is about wiping out resistance to Chinese Communist Party rule. And all of the efforts of the Chinese Communist Party in Tibet over 70 years have failed. All of the violence, you think of their economic, their political, their military power and might, and somehow Tibetans are still resisting, and a whole new generation of Tibetans that has no memory of a free Tibet is still fighting. And that's because who we are at our core is not Chinese. And when Tibetans are being taught only about Chinese history and culture in this intense nationalistic curriculum, they know that they're not reflected there. Maybe it takes the littler kids some time to figure that out, but in the end, Tibetans know they're not Chinese. And when they leave these schools or when they go out into the world, they face such incredible racism and discrimination that their instinct, of course, is to turn inward and to ask questions about who they are and where is Tibet in all of this. And so I think this is about wiping out resistance to Chinese Communist Party rule in places where the Chinese, party rules with a colonial occupation, that the Chinese government has taken over by force and maintains control by force. And parents' influence needs to be, I guess they believe, broken. These children, if they're removed from their parents, their families, and their communities, and if they can forget who they are, maybe that resistance will end. And I think they're sadly mistaken.
Thank you very much. And for Mr. Abdulwali Arab, my both parents fled from North Korea communism during Korean War. So, I've been hearing so much about the communists. And now I am proud American immigrant who is living her American dream. I speak Korean and Japanese as my first and second, and English is my third. It is important to embrace diversity and respect other cultures. I speak common greetings to my constituents and friends on a daily basis. Why is the CCP creating new language restrictions and engaging in religious persecution? What are they afraid of?
I think it's mainly because of Uyghur keep protecting their language, especially like after July 5th, we have a demonstration in 2009, July 5th. And after the demonstration, there is a mass arrest happened, and then thousands of people got arrested. And after that, Chinese government a little bit changed the policy and give some economical benefit to the people. But at the time, I witnessed what happened. And the Uyghur language, for example, Uyghur books flourished, and the Uyghur films flourished, and if Uyghur poetry sold very well. After this economic benefit, Uyghur not shrinked. Instead of that, Uyghur increased the power because of after the economical development, and people realized to take that language alive, keep that language, and they use money to support it. And when I got my mother language kindergarten, investment is already enough. I have enough investment, and I have enough support. At that time, we have we started our campaign online. We have 500,000 followers online to support us. So I think the main reason is because of this power, because of this power of identity, power of culture. They're afraid of this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I think Chairman Merkley is back.
I'm back, and thank you very much. And I'll apologize in advance if I ask questions that others have already asked, but maybe it's worth re-emphasizing. And let me want to start with the depiction of a strategy by the Chinese government to universalize Mandarin among the entire population of China. Do you all agree? I'll just ask each of you to comment very briefly. Do you all agree that getting everyone to speak Mandarin is the ultimate goal of the sinicization campaign that we've all talked about today? Dr. Roche, you want to kick that off?
Sure. Yes, I think it is. This is the goal. The policy has been in place for a while now. The plan has been set. The targets have been announced and shifted year by year. They target different regions as it progresses, and the aim is to have everyone speaking Mandarin, regardless of the cost to other languages, people's identities, communities, families, etc.
Okay. So, and does everyone else agree? Maybe just speak very briefly to that. wipe out basically wipe out every other language except Mandarin Chinese over the process of the next couple decades. Mr. Togochuk?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, their goal is very clear. They are stating publicly the Chinese authorities are stating their goals very publicly, and then they're saying all the 55 so-called ethnic minorities must adopt and embrace the Chinese Zhonghua nationality or Chinese nationality. That's the stated goal. And so the language, the eliminating language and forcing all those 55 ethnic minorities to speak Chinese is not just the only goal. Actually, their ultimate goal is to turn these people's identity into the Chinese or Zhonghua nationality identity.
So it's both about everyone speaking Mandarin, but that is the underlying goal, is to wipe out the ethnic identity of people across China, basically genocide against dozens and dozens of the diverse cultures of the country. Ms. Tae-Tung, when you look at really the strategies being used, including this absolutely horrific separation of small children from their families to boarding schools. I think you said 80% of the children are separated, some 800 to 900,000 children, if I caught those numbers right. So do you see a path in which Chinese government is seeking to essentially wipe out the Tibetan language with another generation?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the focus now on kindergartens or preschoolers, the focus on 4 and 5-year-olds really shows us that it is these children are learning entirely from such a young age, entirely in Chinese or Mandarin, and they are so young. They're also being taught, like, just so that their psychological foundation will be sort of trained to think about Chinese culture and Chinese, to have almost, because they don't live with their parents and their families for the majority of their lives, even if they're just living 5 days a week in these schools, they are, their idea is to really change them on the inside, who they are fundamentally, so as to wipe out resistance.
Yeah, it's so much more than simply language. And Mr. Abdulweli, also, do you see that kind of Chinese goal within a generation is to wipe out the Uyghur language?
Yes, the Chinese goal is, I think, not only wipe out Uyghur language, but also let Uyghur become not the modern Chinese, let them become ancient Chinese. Because from my documentation, those Uyghur kids in kids camp, they forced to recite ancient Chinese texts, not the modern texts, and forced them to wear ancient Chinese clothes, not the modern Chinese clothes, and let them recite something not relevant with this modern society. And I think the ultimate goal is make them more Chinese than ordinary Chinese.
So, Mr. Togochug, you observed that in January of last year, so some 15 months ago, Chinese authorities announced that the legal protections for recognized minority languages are unconstitutional. Of course, it's the Constitution, Article 4 of the Chinese Constitution, which provides for those protections. So can we essentially say that the Chinese Constitution has been invalidated by the Chinese government, and that the protection in the Chinese Constitution, Article 4, no longer exists?
Well, that's correct. So, as we all know, China is not a country of rule of law. So yes, the Chinese Constitution is still there, but in the same time, because of the Mongolian the large-scale protest, they came up with the idea that the Chinese National Congress announced that the all local laws, including the ethnic minority autonomy laws and some other regulations on the minority languages, in particular Mongolian language. They said it's unconstitutional. And then they said these must be changed. So that's their statement. So the goal is clear, right? They just use whatever method available to just change and completely wipe out the Mongolian language, and so they just in this effort they even invalidate their own constitution.
And Mr. Abduweli, and my time is running short, so this will be my last question. You note in your testimony that in 2013, there was a movement among Uyghurs to adopt this slogan: if the Chinese Constitution protects our languages, then it is our turn to protect it. So it was like, okay, hey, the Constitution lays out protection. Let's locally and protect and ensure that Article 4 is followed. But the Chinese reaction was to essentially say, well, the Constitution doesn't really, we're throwing that out. So your effort to seize upon those constitutional protections was unfortunately unsuccessful. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yes, that's correct. That's our slogan, and that's my. I tried to follow the law, and I tried to practice my constitutional rights, but at the end, I didn't succeed. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. This big picture, China has abandoned its constitutional protections. It's wiping out language, but it's not just language. It's trying to wipe out the minority cultures across China. And that's the big picture I want to keep coming back to. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Congressman McGovern, as well. And to our panelists, I've got to briefly run into another meeting, so I'm going to cut right to the chase and just ask each of our panelists the following question. Can you please share your analysis of how the CCP's increased repression of ethnic minorities within China fits into its broader long-term strategy for consolidation of political control? Go ahead, Mr. Ayub.
Hello? Yeah. Could you rephrase your question? I'm sorry.
No problem. My question is, how does the continued and increased repression of ethnic minorities by the Chinese Communist Party fit into the CCP's broader long-term political and state strategy?
Yes, depending on Xi Jinping's speech he made in 2014 in Urumqi, and the one very specific term that break the root. It means that break this culture, separate this. Now the implementing that boarding school and boarding kindergarten and those things, just the implementation of his order, break the root. It means that those kids replace their homes, and they replace their homeland, and they replace their culture. And another Xi Jinping stressed that strengths Zhonghua identity. It means that the only identity allowed in China, and that's why Chinese government had this concentration camp and force those millions of people speak Chinese in that so-called vocational center. And the third, Chinese government transferred the Uyghurs from their own homeland to Chinese cities. Just in 2020, more than 50,000 Uyghur transferred to Xinjiang. It means that like the ultimate goal to like not only let them to speak Chinese, but let them like disappear in Chinese majority in Chinese mainland.
If I may, can I respond to Senator Ossoff's question? So yes, so what's happening in China is it's continuation of what China has been implementing in these three nations, especially in Mongolian case. The new policy, new cultural genocide policy, followed by the so-called second generation bilingual education, is considered by the Mongolians as the final step of China's overall cultural genocide policy that is intended to systematically destroy the language, tradition, and identity of the Mongolian people as a whole. So if you look at the history of the past 73 years history of Southern Mongolia, as early as late 1940s, even before the establishment of the People's Republic of China, Chinese Communist Party took over the Southern Mongolia and implemented the so-called land reform movement, and then they executed tens of thousands of Mongolians and confiscate their land. And then in the 1950s, the Mongolian elite intellectuals were persecuted. And the 1960s and 1970s, for example, there was a large scale genocide campaign. Actually, in this campaign, at least 100,000 Mongolians were tortured to death and 500,000 persecuted. At that time, Mongolian population is only 1.5 million. That means 1/3 of the population is affected by this policy. And then in 2001, Chinese government implemented another set of policy toward the Mongolian traditional way of life, to wipe out the Mongolian traditional way of life. The policies are called like ecological migration and total ban over livestock raising. Under this policy, Mongolian traditional way of life is targeted, and then Mongolian herders who graze their animal on their own land is considered criminals. And then, so now they are targeting Mongolian language. So this is continuing pattern. It's not just the recent policy is not just isolated policy. It's a continuation of overall Chinese policy to destroy the entire nation of Southern Mongolia.
Thank you, Mr. Tobachuk.
Yeah, if I may.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think this is the continuation of, destructive policies and an intention to really, Xi Jinping has just completely accelerated this genocidal project in Tibet and East Turkestan and Southern Mongolia. And I think we can see, with the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, there can be no challenge to their authority. And that's what Tibetans and Uyghurs and Southern Mongolians do by trying to maintain our distinct way of life, our language, our separate national identities. And if you look at China's, threatening of Taiwan, if you look at the crackdown in Hong Kong, if you look at the attack on India, I think we can see that it doesn't end with, it's not like it's just about Tibetans or Uyghurs or, what China considers its internal issues. It goes well beyond. And Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have imperial ambitions. I mean, there is a belief that they have the right to rule over us on their borders and to should have a greater position of power in the world should have more influence at whatever the cost. And to wipe out dissent and to attack people fundamentally who they are, to try to destroy or erase us. I think that, we can see with Russia right now under Putin, the threat that Russia poses to global peace and security, I believe, is the same from the Chinese government. And I think no matter what their propaganda says, trust us, they're very, very good at using benign sounding positive language to mask their intentions. But we know the truth of what they want to do. And they're doing it to us in a way the whole world can see. And I think that's why it's imperative on some level. It's also self-interest, I think, globally, to help to try to push China back to stop this, these genocides happening before our eyes, because it doesn't just stop here, I don't think.
If I may just extend on some of those points there. So with reference to particularly the groups that I've worked with that I call these unrecognized languages, unrecognized groups, in terms of state and political strategy, originally when these policies were formed in several decades ago, the aim of not recognizing those groups, and it was a deliberate process, the aim of that was to accelerate their assimilation. The idea was that those unrecognized groups would assimilate into the recognized 56 nationalities. Then all of those groups would assimilate into a single, basically Han Chinese socialist unity. So it was a deliberate strategy to speed up social evolution towards the socialist future, which would also coincidentally be Han Chinese. And so when those structures were put in place, those structures of recognition, the legal structures, constitutional freedoms for language, the policies of ethnic autonomy, and so on, they were all done with an aim to deliberately drive assimilatory processes, and they have been working as planned for decades now, and we see that in the fate of these unrecognized languages, which people are no longer basically able to transmit to their children, or can only do so with great difficulty. Under Xi Jinping in particular, that goal of accelerating assimilation has taken on goals which are primarily related to China's place on the global stage. It's taken on a geopolitical significance. That those structures that accelerate assimilation are now driving towards producing greater unity, integration, and therefore power that will accelerate China's place in the world order, which the aim is is an ascendant China with a much broader, more important, powerful role on the world stage, and that place on the world stage will be built on the deliberate destruction of these communities.
Thank you all. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you to our co-chairs. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. And Co-Chair McGovern, did you want to ask a second set of questions?
Yeah, briefly, Dr. Roach, you speak to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a mechanism for Indigenous peoples of China to defend their languages. You say that the U.S. should formally endorse the non-binding declaration, as the three other countries who initially voted against it, Canada, UK, Australia, have done. Would endorsement give our government a stronger moral position to urge China to allow its citizens to participate in the UN process?
Yes, it absolutely would give the US a stronger moral foundation for making these claims against China. We see this repeatedly, that when these issues are raised against China, whether it's in diplomatic or governmental forums, or whether it's in the media or social media, that whenever these accusations are brought against China about what they're actually doing, the first strategy that they always go to is one of deflection, to deflect the query back on the accuser and to say, you have no right to accuse us of this when you yourself have done it in your past, you are doing it now, etc., etc. And and then they often go to other strategies of outright denial, conditional denial, and so on and so on. But the first rhetorical strategy is always to deflect the comment back on the accuser, and anything that can be done in that regards will improve the effectiveness of any efforts to hold China accountable for what they are doing. These assimilatory, eliminatory programs.
Thank
So
you.
hopefully that clarifies.
No, it does. Thank you. And thank you for being with us this, I don't know what time it is. What time is it where you are?
It's after midnight now. We started at midnight, so
Yeah, well, thank you. We appreciate you staying up for us here. Thank you. Ms. Tatong, regarding the residential boarding school system in Tibetan areas, can you expand a little bit on the elements of coercion? I mean, do authorities order families to send their kids away? Do they make it a fait accompli by closing local schools, or is it something else? And how would we find out more information about the schools for 4- and 5-year-olds, which you say Chinese authorities are trying to hide?
Thank you for the question, Chairman McGovern. Yeah, it's the Chinese government is making it impossible for Tibetan parents to do anything but comply, both because of the consolidation of schools, and so closing all the local schools, all the alternatives, the monastery schools, the Tibetan-run private schools. So Tibetans, on the one hand, have no choice in most places. If they want their children to get an education, they have to send them away. At the same time, parents do, of course, resist and refuse. And when they do, they are threatened. So they can be threatened with financial punishments. They can be threatened that, the number one thing is if you don't send your child now, say to boarding preschool, then they won't be able to go and join later at grade 1 or in primary school. And so Tibetan parents are really left with, and Tibetans know, anyone under Chinese Communist Party rule knows, you don't disagree, you don't push back. To do in any meaningful way will be considered a threat to the state, and you'll be charged or could be, held accountable for some serious, political charges, even though all you're trying to do is keep your child at home where where you can protect them and watch over them. I know with the boarding preschools, so we're really working to try to understand more about the picture on the ground, and we need governments and everyone to be asking China about the boarding preschools. I think that the Tibetan parents who have tried to, we've been hearing reports recently, Tibetan parents don't want their kids to go to these schools. They don't want to send them away so young. When they have to, like in nomadic communities, we've been hearing that they will go and one nomadic family will move to the township and live in their car, to be near to the kids from that are in that boarding preschool, and the other families back home will take care of their work and their business, and then the families will take turn by turn. It's having a very, very hard, detrimental effect on the life of nomads and rural people. To have such, small children taken away. And then, of course, the things parents try to do, just like in Canada and the residential school history there, just like in the US. And, when these children are taken away, parents try to go and be near them or do, what they can to protect them because they're being taken out of their hands. And we need to know more. China needs to answer and tell us what are the numbers. Just trying to piece together this picture from Chinese state media, from Chinese government sources at every level, from Chinese academics and other academic studies. It really is an incredible challenge, and that's absolutely intentional on the part of the Chinese government to hide this because they know it's wrong.
Thank you, and I apologize. I have to go to another meeting, but before I yield back to Chairman Merkley, let me just thank this incredible panel. This is a important issue. It goes to the issue of identity. It goes to the issue of China trying to wipe out an entire culture. And I think, Ms. Tung, you had mentioned that one of the reasons why they do this is to try to squash resistance. On the other hand, I could make an argument that their repression and they're trying to rob people of their identity, I think only increases resistance in the sense that people are just horrified that there is a entity that wants to rob them of their identity, of their history, of their culture, of their language. And so, as some people have said on this panel, it's really important for us to be able to fund initiatives that will actually protect these languages and to find ways to allow people to, have access to appropriate instruction to be able to pass this on to the next generations. But you have given us some ideas on things that we need to do in the upcoming appropriations process that will be coming up in a matter of weeks, and also some follow-up questions to the Chinese government. But this has been an excellent panel, and I want to thank you all, and I yield back to Chairman Merkley.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair McGovern. And I do have some additional questions I'll continue with. And let me start, Dr. Roche, with the question as to whether the Chinese government is also trying to wipe out or start the process of eliminating the Cantonese dialect in favor of the Mandarin dialect.
Thank you for that question. I'll just give a very brief answer because this is not my specific area of research. I haven't done work in this area, so my understanding of it is from a very broad general background. But so basically, in terms of policy, the same policy of erasure applies, which is that there is limited to no formal support for the Cantonese language. A lot of the support is ad hoc and superficial, which then makes it very difficult for the community to sustain their language. We know that in the past that there have been protests against the imposition of Mandarin in the Cantonese-speaking communities. And interestingly, the protests seem to have had a knock-on effect in Tibet, in part inspiring language protests there, emboldening people. And we see, and I think that that's an important thing to note, is that all of these language contexts are connected. When one group is able to stand up and defend their language, if that information is available to other people and they know that emboldens them, it encourages them, it reminds them of their rights and so on, which is important. But beyond that, I would not like to comment further on the situation of Cantonese because I feel like I don't have the adequate expertise.
Are all of the university admissions in Mandarin, all the university exams?
Across the entire country or just in the Cantonese context?
Across the entire country.
Again, I don't think that I have the up-to-date information on that. I'll pass that over to perhaps one of the other panelists would know. I haven't been able to enter China, so my on-the-ground access to information is now limited, unfortunately.
So for each of you, in regard to Mongolia, Tibet, Uyghur Autonomous Area, are all the university examinations in Mandarin?
Yes, it is, and we have Uyghur exam until 2017, and after that, all college entrance exam are in Chinese.
In Mongolian areas, yes, now the all college exam is it has to be in Chinese. And then there was until recently, until this new policy, there was some very limited number of colleges had some majors in Mongolian. For example, only Mongolian literature and linguistic major was the students are allowed to take exam in Mongolian, but now all these are changing, and then so all students have to take the exam in Chinese.
And Ms. Taetong?
Yes, I believe that's true, and it's also the it's important to point out that for the pressure on Tibetan society and on language and culture is coming from both sides. So the children, the youngest children, are having the language stolen from them, and those in higher academic study are suddenly not able to, so they amalgamated the different departments. So there used to be Tibetan studies and Mongolian studies and Uyghur studies, and they, under the common language policy, they sort of put everyone together, and the only way to teach is in Mandarin, because Tibetans will not speak Uyghur and Uyghurs will not speak Tibetan. And so suddenly there have been Tibetan academics and education specialists who have been working hard for decades to try and promote Tibetan language and Tibetan curriculum and cultural content and everything. And suddenly all of them are faced with with no options to continue with their work. And Tibetan language itself, I mean, as one Tibetan education policy expert from Tibet raised during the Cultural Revolution told us recently, he sees this between the policy for the little kids, the policies for the the higher education, and of course what's happening in the monasteries and on the grasslands. He sees this in a way as a threat that could be the end of our history, and that just really struck me when you think of it all together.
Yeah. It was in that perspective of seeing these many, many different strategies from different angles in which I was inquiring kind of about the plan to wipe out the language and essentially the culture in a generation. You spoke about a pop singer, age 26, I believe, who self-immolated himself. Was he allowed to sing? Did he become a star within Tibet, or was he outside Tibet? Was he allowed to sing in Tibetan inside Tibet and become popular culturally in that language?
Yes, he was. He in particular really had. He was famous in Chinese circles because he was known because he participated in all these Chinese talent shows, like the music sort of idol type shows, and so he became really well known. But he would do, you can see in his lyrics and in his story, he really tried to promote Tibetan language and identity and to have a message in there about the importance of Tibetan homeland, the Tibetan sort of, without saying it, the Tibetan nation and our cultural roots. And I think the key is, if you look from the outside, and this is what China will say, Tibetans have freedom of expression. Look at, they sing in Tibetan, and they, you can see the kids dressed in their Tibetan clothing, and in the end, they do allow a certain amount of cultural freedom and expression, but within a very, 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 very constrained, very limited. There was a platform recently, a Chinese social media platform, that was streaming a conversation between two Tibetan pop stars, very well known, and one was saying to the other, "We can't do this. We shouldn't speak in Tibetan on this platform, or they will shut us down." So you can see, and I think really within a generation, we may see the end. If these genocidal policies are allowed to go ahead, we may see the end of Tibetans who can even sing and express themselves in sort of secondary discourse in Tibetan language.
Well, it's a very powerful story when someone who is so successful and so young takes their own life in protest. And can you give us his name once again?
Yeah, Tsewan Norbu was his name, 25 years old.
Thank you. And I want to turn to Mr. Abduweli. You note in your testimony that the written language was changed from a Uyghur alphabet to a Cyrillic alphabet to a sinicized Latin script. How much does changing the writing play into interrupting kind of the generational cultural traditions and language abilities?
Like my father, when he went to high school, he educated in like Cyrillic alphabet. And then my mother, younger than him, he educated in like Latin alphabet. And they like we have at home we have books in Cyrillic alphabet and we have books in Latin alphabet, but no one can read what's it because it's different alphabet. And then when we start to our primary school, we went first year we study like Latin alphabet, then next year we study like I study like Arabic alphabet, and my brothers cannot read my book, and I cannot read their books. And then like because of that Latin alphabet implemented in Uyghur homeland more than 20 years, so like a generation become illiterate like in 20 because the Latin alphabet implemented 20 years and then suddenly changed it to Arabic alphabet and then those people become illiterate suddenly. So we have 3 times illiteracy, like like use Cyrillic. They don't know like Latin, and then they know Latin, and they don't know the second, the third one. So they have like a third generation, depending on the like this alphabetic change, and this people become illiteracy.
Yeah, thank you. Congressman Steele, I see you've rejoined us. Did you want to ask any additional questions?
I just want to say thank you, and this is so necessary that everybody has to hear and what CCP has been doing. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all the witnesses. And you know what? I'm going to speak up. I'm going to speak against the CCP, and I've been doing that since I got elected 2020. So let's work together and let's make sure that whole world knows that, what CCP has been doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Steele. It's a really valuable contribution, and it's so important to have these hearings so that more of us become educated and articulate about these forms of oppression. And I wanted to ask one last question, Mr. Abduwali, and this ties into a previous hearing we've had, but when you advocated for Uyghur kindergartens and worked to establish them basically under that vision from Article 4 of the Constitution, your family members were oppressed. And I believe your brother and sister have been imprisoned. We understand your niece, I'm very sorry to hear, passed away in detention 2 years ago after returning to Xinjiang from Japan. Did they face imprisonment for their own activities, or was it retaliation in part to send a message to advocates abroad?
Like I started my mother language campaign in 2011, September 15th, my first mother language kindergarten and then my mother language schools. And because of that, I got arrested in 2013 and August 19. And in Turkey in 2017, because of like Uyghur students arrested in Egypt, July 4th, 2017, and I received their voice message and written message, and I spoke up. And because of this, my older brother got arrested, and I learned that he's sentenced 14 years. And then, because of my activism, my younger sister, she forced to denounce me more than a year, like started in 2016 till 2017 September. Entire year she like criticized me and denounced me and claimed that I'm a separatist or something like that. And then at the end, she also ended up in the concentration camp and then sentenced 12 years. I think it's and then in 2019 in November, I participated leaking the document, Xinjiang file and Karkash list. And because of that, my wife's family member, because at that time we have some contact, and then my wife's family members got arrested. And so I think those are related to like when I take some action, when I speak up in this next step, the retaliation. So I think it's related to the retaliation, and let me stop. And like my niece, when she was in Japan, and she told me really clearly that like you became a hero, and my father and my aunt become victim because of you. So I feel really sorry what happened to her. She went back to Japan because of she just under this like control of Chinese police through Chinese social media app WeChat. The Chinese police there always force her to stop me, and but she couldn't stop me, and because of this, at the end she like went back to China, and she died in detention. That place, like I was first arrested and sexually abused there. So I feel really sorry about it. I hope this retaliation will stop, and I hope this atrocity will stop. So
It's absolutely horrific, and I'm sure very effective in suppressing conversation about China's many assaults on human rights. But this retaliation against family for freedom of speech abroad is just, I think about this, and I think, why do we allow any import, any recognition, any validation of the Chinese government, given the many, many crimes against humanity that we've witnessed through this series of hearings? And so thank you for sharing that story, and we all just are in great empathy with the horrific situation it puts you in, and everyone who wants to speak up from their heart to about human rights abuses inside China. I really appreciate all of you on the panel for sharing your knowledge and experience. We have to keep speaking out. We cannot let Chinese pressure in any form against our companies, against advocates within our country, against Chinese citizens abroad stop us from scrutinizing and publicizing these activities. Without scrutiny, without publicization, there's no chance to diminish this strategy of wiping out the languages and the cultures of the many groups within China. And with that, I know I have an official script here somewhere for closing. Specifically, the record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, April 8th. And for any members who would like to put additional things into the record, please, you are welcome to do so. And I extend that invitation to our panel of experts as well. Thank you. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.